allow you to do anything. You would still have to take on your own capitalist class, your own ruling class, and huge battles would be ahead there. But nevertheless, I think it would be a kind of sign of intention, and also would free up your hands to do certain things you can't do at the moment. And I think that there are a number of states, I think, in Europe, integrated in different degrees into the EU, which are looking and possibly hoping someone makes a break, and people are probably expecting it to be Greece, that allows that kind of alliances to begin to be built. Then the whole thing would begin to unravel, and I think that can't come soon enough.
Just as a last thing, what about the situation of sort of Norway, where they've kind of got 1 foot in and 1 foot out of it? They seem to take the bits they want, but don't bother with the bits they don't like.
I think it's possibly that Norway's allowed to do this because no one really cares very much what it does one way or the other. I mean, Norway's a stable state. It does, it abides by the rules. It's tended to line up with Germany, whereas Italy and so on tend to line up behind France in terms of its overall direction. But I think they can allow that in 1 or 2 cases in order to keep them on board. Britain would be a totally different thing, and certainly the kind of states that are clearly in major problems, like Greece and I think Spain as well, would not be allowed to flout the rules because they'd be seen as getting away with it. Norway hasn't done anything like that, so it's in a sense it's allowed to get away with these things, but it's marginal. These are states on the margins of it, which don't fundamentally affect the whole project. If it felt like it was actually going to do something that would seriously undermine the EU project, I'm sure they'd begin to start being much stricter about what they couldn't do.
Okay, thanks very much for speaking to us, Neil.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Colin. How's it going?
It's going great, Michael. Smashing. I'm in the middle of election fever with just over a week to go. Can hardly contain myself.
No, because I would have thought that at this point in the election campaign, Jim Murphy's marvellous socialist rhetoric, and obviously the fact that he's socialist to his core and he shows it every day, I thought it would have just convinced you to give up the ghost by now.
Sorry, you lost me there when you said Jim Murphy the socialist. I've no idea who you're talking about. Is there such a person in Scotland? I mean, Jim Murphy, the former Labour MP, with a week to go, I think is more likely. That's a better nomenclature for the guy, I think. But, the election campaign here in Scotland is like 1997. 1997, if you can cast your mind back to then, the overriding mood was, we've had 20 years of the Tories, we've got to get rid of the Tories. Here we are in 2015, and the overriding mood is, we've got to get rid of the Red Tories, we've got to get rid of New Labour, and that's about what we're going to do in a week's time.
Yeah, it's quite bizarre. We've gone from Jim Murphy, Blairite unionist, to Jim Murphy, I'm not a unionist or I'm not a Blairite.
Yeah, he's now trying to pretend he's Leon Trotsky in disguise, but I don't think it'll work, do you?
Well, no. I can't really say any more to it than that. But
exactly.
Before we get down to the business here, because last time I did an interview, we were talking about the left-wing case for leaving the European Union. But before we get into the left-wing case for staying in, which I think you're going to give us, would you agree that it's important not to leave the left-wing case against the EU to people like UKIP?
Yeah. I mean, the case against the European Union from the left is a principle case. It's perfectly legitimate, perfectly rational, and actually it wants to get to the same objectives that I want to get. So it's more a tactical question than a principled one. So I think it's absolutely right. You're doing the public broadcasting a service by, presenting both sides of the picture. I'm always a great believer in putting both sides of the case fairly and allowing people to engage in the intellectual grey matter rather than, setting up canards. You don't do justice to the other side case, hoping that it makes your case look better. That's never I think that's a reasonable or safe way to go forward. So, yeah, absolutely. Put the case against leaving the EU to achieve a socialist federation in Europe, and the case for staying in and changing it from within.
Yeah, so we're not doing call K here. So we're going to get down to the bones.
Okay. Call Michael. Hey, Michael, I've got a problem. No, but yeah, absolutely.
Well, I tend to keep out the lunacy aspect of it, unlike call K. But in the broadest sense, on a principled sense first, what's the case for the EU? Well,
the 500 million people across Europe are now members of the European Union and the various component countries. 500 million working class people with an awful lot in common. And it's essentially, the European Union started as a trading bloc, didn't it, way back in the 1950s. And it's grown and grown. It's now, 27, 28 countries, whatever it is. And essentially, it's encouraged that sense of we're in together. It's emphasised the things we have in common, emphasised the thing that we have in common the most, which is that we largely sell our labour on a daily basis, doing our best to survive. So the case of the European Union is I think it brings people closer together. And perhaps, I know you can overstate this, but it is worth remembering that there was 2 world wars that were centred and started in Europe in the 20th century, and it's no small thing that we should try and avoid that collectively as much as we can. So I think there's a strong case for pulling all the resources and all the peoples and all the talents of Europe together for everyone's collective advantage. That's the plan. Admittedly, we're not anywhere near that, but that's the ambition, and I think it's right to have ambitions in politics as in life in general.
And there are certain, now I'm doing the positive case now, and there are certain aspects of the EU that do help for working people in the sense that, right, you've got like the social charter, certain things about contracts, you can't work more than a certain amount of hours, certain things about human rights as well. I mean, these things are not to be sniffed at.
They're not to be sniffed at, but as a socialist, I'm bound to say the potential that exists with 500 million people working together and pulling in the same direction has barely been scratched. The surface of that has barely been scratched. What achievements the European Union has in bringing people together have been very much at the minor end of it and have been very much within a template as long as it's agreed by the major corporations who are in control of it. So the fundamental problem that every socialist across Europe would share is that the European Union's a bosses' club. The rules are set down for the bosses, by the bosses, to enhance and to help their trade with one another, but they're often at the detriment of workers, whether they're in Ireland or Romania, the length and breadth of the continent. So there's a great deal more progress can be made. But one of the things I have to say that I'm reminded of, I grew up in the west of Scotland in the 1960s and 70s, and I'm old enough to remember tomatoes being grown in Clydeside, red tomatoes. Because in the 1960s, there was greenhouses right along the banks of the Clyde from Motherwell up to Kirkfield Bank and Lanark. And, my dad and mum's generation would tell you tomatoes today don't taste anywhere near as nice as the ones you used to get in, the Clyde Valley in the 1960s. But when you think about that concept, there were massive greenhouses growing tomatoes, largely because the price of keeping those greenhouses warm was so low. And they thought they could compete with areas of Europe, let's say, where tomatoes grow outside and they don't need to have greenhouses full of paraffin, So those days are over, but it did seem for me to hint that there was a socialist plan, that under a socialist plan across continental Europe, those countries with natural and plentiful supplies of sunshine and warmth could grow the tomatoes, and Scotland could concentrate on the whiskey and the shipbuilding and the other things that we did because of the advantages that we had, natural and others, So that always struck me as a bizarre idea, that Scotland should try and compete with southern Spain or Italy, Greece, Portugal or elsewhere, where huge tomatoes could be grown relatively easily and certainly more cheaply.
So the trading bloc idea of it is one part of it, but I think there's definitely kind of 2 currents to the EU. There's the social sort of side of it, which is basically what probably both of us would consider as the positive aspect of it. But then there is a kind of neoliberal bloc to it as well. And that's become much more so since the beginning of it. Like you mentioned earlier, the fact that, it was the idea of keeping the economies together and that would prevent war, which on the whole it has done, and that's a marvellous thing and never to be forgotten. But as we've progressed, and with Thatcher and Reagan, and the politics of most countries has become more and more neoliberal, the European Union has also gone in that direction as well. So as someone who would support the European Union, how would you defend the EU against that? In that, what should we do about it? What can be done about it?
Perfectly fair question. I think my answer would be, I support the European Union with enormous caveats. And one of the caveats that it has to be changed beyond all recognition from the current circumstances, because what happens is that the major corporations of Europe tend to use one country's labour force against the labour force of another country within the EU, you know. So it's not that long ago since, remember, Ford would open plants in certain parts of Europe and then demand that the British workforce or the French workforce or the German or Belgian or Spanish workforce adhere to the same rules of factories in, let's say, Eastern Europe. And if they didn't, those factories would be closed and production would be shipped to, in effect, cheap labour sources. So we have a European Union where, sacre bleu, no news to socialists, of course, the bosses across Europe unite together to exploit working people regardless of their language, their nationality, or anything like that. That's not the Europe that I want to be part of. I think that my generation, possibly yours generation, Michael, we're able to know many people from across Europe on first-name terms. In Edinburgh, for example, there's a huge number of young Spaniards who've come here recently, and they're very welcome. Young Greeks have come here, there's Italians, there's French. You know, it's a much more cosmopolitan city in Edinburgh, and indeed most places in Scotland, than it was 25 years ago. That's a good thing that Labour has been allowed to travel. It breaks down those barriers and those naff TV programmes, you know, mind your language, where all the national stereotypes of the day were put in front of everybody, which was a disgrace, an outrage. Those have largely been broken down, and that's a good thing, but we still have the problem that the employers, they want to divide and conquer. So, yes, I'm in favour of the EU, but not as it's currently constituted, because the wrong people are in charge of it. And let's not forget, 500 million people, and not a single one of us have any real democratic control over it, because the European Union is run by unelected commissioners appointed by governments, people like Leon Britton, Peter Mandelson. None of these were elected, were they? They were all appointed, and of course, that's where the power is, and that's what's all wrong with it. The power's in the wrong place. It's not at all democratic.
This seems to be the thing. It needs to be, if you wanted to reform it from inside. Now, the Parliament is there, and a lot of the actual best stuff that comes from the European Union comes from the Parliament.
That's because that's the democratic driver, the democratic driver for change. And all the best changes have come through democracy. All its worst aspects come from the lack of democracy. You know, these commissioners set down rules which state that, you know, you can't have the ferries off the west of Scotland remaining in public ownership. The ferries that leave the docks at the Piraeus port in Greece to all the islands can't remain in public ownership. Who said that? That wasn't the democratic wishes of the peoples of Europe. That was the diktat, in effect, of commissioners, as you say, driven by a neoliberal agenda that best serves Tysons, Siemens, Peugeot, you know, the big corporate elite in Europe. They're the ones that are driving it, and that's what has to be challenged. I don't think anybody in the left across Europe would demur from that. That's a goal that we all share, you know. The question arises is quite, how are you going to challenge their power?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. It's a big question. How do we rebalance it in favour of the social elements? Because it seems that it would need a wide consensus across a number of countries. It
does. You know, that's a $64 million question, and if the left is honest with itself, we're nowhere near as unified in terms of organisation and contact with one another than we ought to be. I mean, I've seen this from my own eyes. I went to Athens in January to witness, invited there by Syriza, you know, the radical coalition of the left in Greece who won the election. And I was coming across people from the Linke in Germany, the French, you know, socialists, the Spanish people in Podemos, Syriza, people from Finland and the left, all these, and thinking to myself, goodness gracious, we've got so little contact with people, and these people, and yet we're charged with such a responsibility to coordinate our work together, press for a common objective, and we need to firm up, be far, far better in our communications with one another and our strategic impulses in the same direction. So that's the answer. I think the answer is to use the 500 million people potentially across Europe who would back up our desires for greater democracy and greater social cohesion and greater social advance than somehow leaving and saying, to hell with it, let them sort out their own trouble. That just seems to me not a tactic that's likely to succeed, you know.
No, I'd agree with that to an extent because the bones of something that could be very good are there. It just needs to be pushed in another direction.
Absolutely, and I tell you, one of the things that strikes me in Britain